On February 4th, 2026, Republican legislatures in the state of Utah introduced a bill seeking to make some pretty radical changes to its death penalty statutes. Now, as we'll see, on top of being a pretty radical departure from Republicans in Utah, their prior stance on the death penalty statute, this statute also seeks to expedite the death penalty sentence process. It seeks to make it a bit more difficult for defendants to challenge findings or rulings in regards to their competency, and also seeks to help bolster the state's ability to protect or defend challenges against death penalty sentences on appeal. I'm attorney Greg Lake. Welcome to the Entheogenic Esquire podcast and YouTube channel. Let's hop right in and take a look at this. And at the end, we're going to come back and do some analysis about the timeline and substance of these changes in terms of the Tyler Robinson trial and potential death penalty case. So let's take a look. So here we have an article, and this is from KSL.com. This is one of the local media stations who publishes a lot of articles. They've pretty much covered every bit of these proceedings with Tyler Robinson. Here's the title. It says, "Death Penalty Bill in Utah Could Shape the Fate of Tyler Robinson." And we're going to obviously talk much more about this throughout this video. But here it says, the bill HB 495 was sponsored by House Majority Whip Candace B., who I don't want to butcher her name, Pierucci, who's a Republican. And it says it would change the legal and procedural framework for capital cases. So let me jump over real quick and show you something, because in the introduction I said this represents a pretty crazy departure from their prior stance on it. And so I saw this article here. It says that in 2022, 2 Republican legislatures proposed legislation to end Utah's death penalty. The legislation garnered support from victims' families, business leaders, and a bipartisan coalition of Utah prosecutors. The Wall Street Journal wrote at the time that Mr. Leavitt's decision was part of a growing... Okay, and so what they're referencing here is that the prior Utah County DA actually had pledged not to use the death penalty, and we'll talk a bit in a minute about Jeff Gray, who's the current DA, and his position on it. But anyways, it notes here that at the time, at least in 2022, there was a push even amongst Republicans across the country towards trying to end the death penalty. And it says here that a bill had already been introduced in Utah to replace the death penalty, but it failed in its committee on a 6-5 vote. So it is worth noting that, okay? But as we'll see through this video, this is, going from, we're not going to support the death penalty. Granted, the bill to eradicate it failed, but to switch all the way to what we're about to see this bill does, I think you'll agree, represents a pretty radical departure. One thing I did want to point out, though, before we move on is, I guess you could say, the prudency of these things. It says here, since 1973, at least 200 people have been exonerated and freed from death row in the United States, representing a significant number of wrongful convictions. For every 8 individuals executed, 1 person on death row has been found innocent. Okay, and the reason why I show that is just to establish that there is prudency in either eradicating the death penalty, or at the very least making sure that death penalty statutes very much accommodate challenges before executions are carried out. Lest I digress. So here we also have another Republican in the House there in Utah stating that this bill would tighten timelines for these cases, which have historically taken decades to resolve. They have, but I think as the statistics show, there's some reasoning behind that. So they give this example here of the Ralph Menzies case, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But apparently this guy, okay, and just listen to this timeline, was supposed to be executed in September of 2025, okay, but it was successfully challenged, and a 5-0 decision from the Utah Supreme Court stopped it because another evaluation of his competency had found that he wasn't competent to stand trial or face execution, and then he died of natural causes in November. Now, I looked online, and maybe you can do some looking too, but I did not see anywhere when this occurred, from when this happened in September through this February 6th announcement in this article that we're going through, basically stating that this Menzies case was the impetus for all this. this was not previously announced. So even though this Menzies case occurred at the time and seemingly up until February 6th, there was no indication that this was ringing the alarm bells, so to speak, okay? Anyways, it goes, this bill is seeking to shorten that timeline to save taxpayer dollars, but still allow for the whole process to play out. Okay, it says speeding up capital cases by reducing procedural ambiguity and strengthening, this is the bill, strengthening the state's ability to defend death sentences on appeal. It's attempting to appeal-proof death sentences by limiting gray areas, okay? And it also, as I said in the beginning, it seeks to make drastic changes to intellectual disability determinations, okay? It says that the court shall appoint a pre-screening psychologist to determine the defendant's intelligence quotient. And we're going to talk about this in a minute in context of media coverage of Tyler Robinson's case. I think y'all know what I'm getting at. But here it says if a defendant's IQ is above 75, capital punishment remains an option. But if it's not above 75 or below, 75 or below, the court must order further expert evaluation. So if it's initially found that the defendant isn't competent to face the death penalty, well, it's required that further analysis be conducted. Now, before we move on here to analyzing this, I do want to show here. So this is a copy of the proposed bill, and I show you this because it proves here that it was actually February 4th when this was actually introduced. And then I wanted to go down here and just show you quickly just a portion of it to give you an idea about the expediting of timelines, okay? And this is very important for us too, because as we'll see here, it says when a defendant has pled guilty or been found guilty of a capital felony, so if Tyler Robinson, theoretically, if legally everything checks out, if he is found guilty of a capital felony, further proceedings shall immediately be conducted on the issue of the defendant's sentence for the capital felony. Okay, so this basically means that if he's found guilty, they will be segueing immediately into the death penalty portion of his trial of his case. Okay, so let's switch out of here real quick, and we're going to do some further analysis. Now that we've taken a look at the, primary sources informing us about this change in, or potential change in Utah's death penalty statute, let's look at this in the context of Tyler Robinson's trial, okay? So one, this kind of crazy shift in policy, right? So we saw in 2022, the Republicans, at least in the state of Utah, and it indicated perhaps part of a larger trend, were looking to even abolish the death penalty. Now, that didn't pass, right? But let's look at this in contrast to consider at one point in 2022, these Republicans were seeking to abolish the death penalty, and now they're seeking not only not to abolish it, but to expedite it, make it harder for defendants to challenge it, and make it harder for defendants to challenge competency findings or rulings, okay? And so doesn't that seem kind of odd? And then we're given that the impetus for this shift, or at least the impetus towards this move to make edits or changes to the death penalty statute, had to do with a gentleman who was, just so happens, supposed to be executed in September, and then a 5-0 ruling from the Utah Supreme Court delays it, dying of natural causes in November. And as I mentioned, I can't find any prior mention prior to this February article I read you where the Republicans had made any mention that that case was making them, take another look at their stance on the death penalty, okay? So again, just pointing out some things that are a little bit odd here. Now, also in the context of the Tyler Robinson case, talking about his competency. If you remember, at least in my memory, I remember a lot of media coverage talking about how smart, and indeed I believe that he is, right? But there was a lot of media attention that focus, looking back, seemed to focus pretty strongly on how smart and how competent that Tyler Robinson is, okay? So that's also a data point there that struck me as a little, maybe odd a little bit. but I also want to talk about in the context what this statute, if passed, might mean in terms of what we'll see in Tyler Robinson's proceeding. Well, the part of the statute that I read you right, it basically says that in this case, if he is found guilty, well, then it will basically proceed immediately into the death penalty phase of his trial, okay? And right now, considering that the defense, which again, I find this very odd, that the defense is actually trying to have their pretrial evidentiary motions at least remain private, and also seeking to exclude cameras in the media from the proceedings. Okay, so if that is successful, essentially what we'll have is a black box proceeding, and once it's concluded, well, it will immediately transition over into the death penalty phase. It will be harder for Tyler Robinson to challenge his competency if there's any chance of it, right? And so in a sense, we won't really have any indication as to the veracity, or, at least gauge how we feel about the process if media cameras are excluded. And then we keep going forward, and it will be harder for Tyler Robinson to appeal any death sentence imposed. Okay. And so again, these are things that in the context seem like they really want to not have Tyler Robinson with us. And so, Barron said on his podcast the other night, he doesn't believe that Tyler Robinson, with the people, potentially behind this, wasn't supposed to survive. And so is this the powers that be? Is this their power move to come and try to clean all this up at the end? It's very, very interesting. And so I just wanted to point this out to you. I was surprised when I found this. Well, I say I'm surprised. I hated to see this today, but it's very interesting in the total context of everything that's going on. What are your feelings about this? Does this signal to you that perhaps there are powers that be seeking to railroad Tyler Robinson into a death sentence? Very interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great rest of your weekend.